All right, good morning. Time to get started. We appreciate you coming to class this morning. We've got 2 weeks left in this quarter, and I've been debating on what to teach next quarter, and then something happened that allowed me to pick something very easily, and I'll explain all that in 2 weeks, so stay tuned. But we'll be moving away from talking about elders that we have this quarter. There's so much more that can be said about and what an elder, the role of an elder, than what I've already covered. I've really, a lot of ways, scratched the surface. You could probably talk about qualities and things about an elder for several quarters, but we're going to move on. I think I've covered the things that I've studied and looked at and experienced in the past. I think I've covered most of those things. There are times when the role takes on it always takes on a very serious aspect of the Lord's church, but there are times whenever it's very trying. I'm not going to ever pretend that there are not going to be trying times, just like in your own life. There are trying times. There's a book that I referred to earlier by Glenn Colley called Headed to the Office, and it's geared more, and the reason I decided at the last minute not to cover that, it's really geared more toward young men to aspire to be an elder from the time that they're teenagers until they become mature and older. In other words, working toward that all the time, and I think that's important. But I decided I found this book by Wendell Winkler, and I think it's a very good book. I highly recommend it. But there's another book that Glenn Colley wrote called Awake at Night, and it talks about some of the difficult decisions that elders have made. Of course, he changed the names of and slightly changed the situations that would keep an elder awake at night. My wife tells me that I'm the exception to that. I've never had a problem going to sleep, ever. Even when terrible things are going on. I can remember only one night in the past, I don't know, I'm 62 years, I guess. Maybe one night where I actually stayed awake because of something going on in my life. But it's just something I've been able to compartmentalize and get the rest that I've always needed to get. I'm also very fortunate to be one of those people that when it's time to go to sleep, I go to sleep. I don't sit there and sort of fall asleep, if that makes sense. I close my eyes and it's sleep time, and I go to sleep. And I kid around saying sometimes it takes me 5-6 seconds to doze off, but so I've been very fortunate and blessed in that. But that doesn't mean I don't. When I did serve as an elder, that I didn't take it seriously. That's not. I'm not. Please don't misunderstand me. But I was able to compartmentalize and get the rest needed. So 2 things I wanted to talk about today, and then next week I'll try to. There's 2 other things that I want to cover next week, if Lord willing, and maybe 3 things next week if we have time. Optimism. Brother Winkler makes a statement in his book, and I think it's an interesting one that when I first read it, I thought, I'm not sure where he's going with that, but I think the more I thought about it and the more I gave it some consideration, I think he may be very right. He said there's no such thing as a negative leader. The 2 things are exclusive to one another. In other words, if you're negative, you're not really leading. And when I first read that, I thought, well, sometimes you have to be correct things that are wrong, and I don't think he's meaning that. What he means is it's hard to get people motivated if you're negative. It's hard to lead people if you're not a positive person. And I think sometimes we look at optimism in the form of, well, it's my personality is this or my personality is that. And if I happen to have an optimistic attitude or personality, great. And if I don't, well, that's my personality. I would argue or suggest to you that optimism is a choice. I choose whether to be optimistic or not. And the more I choose to be optimistic, the more optimistic of a person that a person becomes, whether it's me or anyone else. And if I choose negative, to look at the negative side of things, then I tend to be more negative. So I would suggest that what Brother Winkler is saying here is very true. Now, I think everyone can come out of negativism and into optimism. I fully believe that, but it's a process. And it may not be what you, let me back up. How do you develop a personality? You come out of the womb and all your personality is fixed. Yes or no? No. Why? That's what we have to remember. Why is my personality not fixed at birth? Anybody? How do we learn? Well, you create one in a way, yes, but how do we learn? Environment plays a big part in it. What you're exposed to teaches you. Have you ever heard the expression, experience is the best teacher? Our experiences shape us. If a person is brought up in a loving, trusting home, they tend to be loving and trusting. If a person is brought up in a home that is full of chaos and they cannot be trusted, the people that have care over that infant cannot be trusted to take care of that infant in the right way, what happens to that infant? They develop a lack of trust in people. Ultimately, they're going to develop a lack of trust in everything in their life. Now, that's very sad, and a lot of us look at that and say, well, that I wouldn't let that happen, and I get that. But we have to realize that we live in a fallen world. And unfortunately, sometimes that happens. When I was doing prison work, I saw this time and time again. I would teach classes about having the behavior of a Christian, having biblically based behavior. It was called New Life Behavior Ministries, was a curriculum that I used. And it basically would tell them, no matter what your upbringing was, you can make a change in your life. And it's true of everyone. I may have been brought up in a very negative environment, an environment that was not conducive to me being an optimistic person. That doesn't mean that that's how I'm going to be all the rest of my life. I can decide to break that cycle, so to speak, and be positive. I may have told you this before, but I'm going to repeat it because I think it bears on what we're talking about here. One of the best students I ever had was actually someone I could not convert to the Lord's church. He practiced Islam, but he came to me and he took all my classes. And he came to me as he was finishing up the last class that I taught. I think there was 8 or 9 of different ones that I taught. And as he was finishing up the classes, he came to me and he said, you know, if I had had some kind of scripture in my life when I was younger, I would not be here today. And he meant in prison. And I understand that completely. And I agree with that. When we put godly principles into our life, and from the very beginning of our life is going to be different than if we do not have that foundation, that building up of godly principles in our life. So, to be an optimistic person, what do I need to do? I want us to look at 2 passages, and we may not think of these when we think of optimism, but I want you to consider that I think they are very optimistic-looking passages. The first one, if you can't read the board, it's Matthew 28 and verses 18 to 20. And we look at this, and if you've been brought up in the Church of Christ or been in the Church of Christ very long at all, you've heard these passages. We're very familiar with them. It's Jesus giving a final instruction right before he ascends back to the Father, and it's kind of the last marching orders, if you will, for the apostles. Those 12 men, well, at the time, 11 men, had a very huge responsibility. And they went about fulfilling that responsibility that Jesus gave them. So somebody read Matthew 18 to 20. But wait, back up to verse 17. Somebody read 17 to 20 of Matthew 28.
When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and spoke to them, saying, All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age.
Is doubt normally associated with positivity or negativity? Negative, right? Mostly. Now, certainly you can put a positive slant on anything. But here the apostles doubted. Jesus knew that they were going to receive the Holy Spirit very soon. And instead of rebuking them necessarily for their doubt, Jesus is positive. And he says, here's what I want you to do. And then that was just read for us. I'm not going to read it all again. But he gives them their marching orders. Now, turn over to Colossians chapter 1. Colossians chapter 1. It's a very daunting task that the apostles are given. But I think it's interesting what Paul tells us. As he's talking to the Christians here in Colossae, if you back up to verse number 21, he tells them that they were formerly outside of Christ. They were very negative. They were engaged in evil. And then verse 22, he says, but now you've been reconciled. A very positive thing has happened in their life. In his fleshly body through death, verse 22, in order to present you before him, holy, blameless, and beyond reproach. Absolutely positive. Then he says, gives a condition to that you've got to continue in the faith, firmly established and steadfast. Verse 23 I'm reading from. Not moved away from the hope of the gospel that you have heard. Now notice the next phrase, which was proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, was made a minister. This is, to me, is one of the most positive passages in all the Bible. If we look at this in the right way, I can have a positive, optimistic look toward evangelism. 12 men. Now, no, they did not do it by themselves. And they were not told they had to do it by themselves. But 12 men in a very short time made disciples who went out and also helped create more disciples by teaching them the gospel and the gospel touching their hearts and them responding to the gospel in the right way. Paul says all creation, all known earth had responded to the gospel. That's an amazing thing. And we look at that sometimes and we think, wow. Now, the known world may not have been as big as what we have in the known world today, but that's still an amazing feat that happened during the first century. So when we get down about nobody seems to want to study the Bible, we need to remember not everybody responded. That's not what Paul said. Not everybody's, he said it wasn't all obeyed in all creation. He said it was proclaimed in all creation. Our job is not to force or coerce people to be Christians. Our job as Christians is to go and teach. Now, if we do it in the right way, we will make disciples. Jesus never said everybody's going to respond to the gospel. In fact, the parable of the sower, we can go to that, and Jesus says this is basically the 4 basic responses that's going to be to the gospel message. And we know 3 of the 4 are not as positive as they could be. One is outright rejection, one is quickly fades away, and one gets choked away after a later time. But 1 out of the 4 is going to respond with a good heart and bear more fruit. Let's be that one as Christians. Let's be the one out of the 4 that wants to bear fruit and proclaim his creation throughout all creation, which means everyone that's in our circle of influence and those maybe even outside our circle of influence. You never know the person you convert or that you lead to conversion who obeys the gospel. You never know what they may do in their lifetime. And you've had a direct impact on that. But we all know God is the one who gives the increase, 1 Corinthians 3:5. He's the one that gives the increase, not me. I can't save anyone. It's God, and it's always God, and he gets the glory for all of it. But if a leader is not optimistic about that, then they're not leading. They're not taking the charge that Jesus has given. So we have to be, as an elder, they have to be optimistic. Jesus was optimistic, if you think about it. When he gave this, he said, this is what I want you to do. And he didn't give this and say, I know you're going to have a lot of difficulty, and I know not everybody's going to obey, but this is what, he didn't say that. He just said, you go, and you teach, and you make disciples, and you're going to baptize them, and then you're going to teach them more. Jesus was very optimistic the whole time he was here on earth in his ministry. Yes? Nope, not what Jesus said. Correct. Absolutely. If you didn't hear what Jerry said, we have to do it the way Jesus said to do it. If we're not doing that, then they have not been converted according to Scripture. Let's turn over to read about the Apostle Paul in Philippians 4, chapter 4, Philippians 4. Somebody will read verse number 13. If you go back to verse, you don't have to, but if you go back to verse 10, it kind of sets up verse 13. I think Paul, we look at this passage, and sometimes this is one that we frame, do a needlepoint and put it on our wall, or we put it on our wall with the fancy letters that kits that you can buy, and it becomes trite, it becomes trivial because we see it all the time. But if we back up and really consider what Paul's talking about, he's saying I can get along in the best of times, and I can get along in the worst of times. Why? And then he gives the answer in verse 13. I can do all things through Christ, or through him who strengthens me. Jesus is who we should always look to for strength. It's not my strength alone that's going to keep me optimistic, but looking to Christ and looking to the example that he was all the time, and those who followed him and the example they give and the positive influence they had in their life. The Apostle Paul is certainly one who gave up a lot, and gave up more than we probably even know. All right, let's look at an example from that God's people have always, or those who are most faithful to God have always been positive leaders. Let's go back to Numbers chapter number 13. Numbers 13. I think we studied this in a Wednesday morning class. Don was teaching about against all odds, and he gave them as an example. So in Numbers 13, we're not going to read the whole thing, but you go through it, and starting with verse 1, and he gives all these different tribes and the people in the tribes, and he told them to spy out the land of Canaan. Send some men, and names all the ones that he sends. 2 of them, of the 10, come back and give a report that let's go do it, because God said we can do it. 10 of the 12 said, oh no, there's big people and they're really scary. And of course I'm paraphrasing here. But they were not positive. They were negative. They weren't going to lead anybody into the land of Canaan. But Joshua and Caleb were steadfast in their faith in God and said, because of God, we can take this. It's not us that's going to take this. It's not us that's going to do it. It's God. He's going to do it. So when we think of leaders like that, we should always look to all the different examples. I think it's wonderful that Joshua and Caleb are given to us as examples of positivity and optimism, but it was because of their faith in God. So if I lack optimism, I need to examine myself and say, how is my faith in God right now? Am I trying to trust in myself? Or am I looking to Christ that strengthened Paul and can give me strength if I will just allow him to do that? So elders should always, always, always be optimistic. 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 7 tells us that we're not given a spirit of fear. Some translations say timidity. Now, not being timid does not mean I need to be prideful or haughty, certainly. But it also means I should not look at it that way. There was a preacher one time who came into a city, and the city had a population. Just for ease of use, let's say 10,000 people. And he said, no matter where I go to preach, this preacher would say this, no matter where I go to preach, my goal is to get 10% of the population of whatever city I'm working in to be members of the church. So what's 10% of 10,000? What's 10%? 1,000, right. Think about that for a minute. Is that some optimism? If we're not careful, we can very quickly be very cynical about that, can't we? We're very cynical about that. But you know what that preacher would say to those who were cynical? He says, don't worry, I got enough faith for you and me. That's what he would say. Now that would give pause to even the most cynical of any person. Now, maybe it's a goal that will never be reached. But we looked at a few weeks ago, if an elder or maybe it was last week, doesn't have vision and goal setting, then you're never going to try to reach a goal. You have to have a goal to reach toward. So if we want to be optimistic, and I don't even, what's the population of Pacific? I don't even know. Does anybody know? 7,000. So if we say 1% of 7,000, what's that, Aaron? Or 10%? 10% would be 700. Can we get 700 people to be Christians in Pacific? I don't know. But if we don't set a goal of at least converting one person, we're not going to convert anybody. We're not going to bring the gospel to anybody. Every year when I was in prison ministry, people would ask me, how many baptisms do you want to have this year? And I would never set a number. I would say I want to get one first. I never set a number any year. Now, I am proud to say that because of God's great message, more than one was converted every year. But I never set a goal more than one, because I'm not going to get any unless I can convince one person that God's message is what they need to be following. Now, again, I know it's not me. It's the power of God's message, but I've got to deliver it. I've got to proclaim it. That's what Jesus said to do. Go and teach. Go and teach. So elders need to be optimistic. They should never be negative. And that's difficult at times. It's difficult. Do you know anybody that's negative? Yes or no? Yeah, sure, we all do. You ever known anybody to be negative that's a member of the Lord's church? Absolutely, we all have. And probably at one time or another, we may have been that negative person, right? And I'm right there with you. There are times when it's hard to be optimistic. Yes. Right. Yes. Or I've been in congregations where something is brought up and they'll say, oh, we tried that 15 years ago. Didn't work then. Why would it work now? Well, it's 15 years later, for one thing. Probably a lot of different people live in the town now than did 15 years ago. Maybe somebody had an experience in their life that may cause them to think about their spirituality more. All kinds of reasons to never, ever, 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 ever give up. Could those 12 men have proclaimed the gospel in all creation if they were negative? Yes or no? I would say a resounding no. They needed to be positive. You had something, Esteban? Anybody ever hear about Noah? Anybody remember Noah? How good of a preacher was Noah? Would you hire Noah today? I would. I would. Why? He was persistent. We're told in the New Testament he preached righteous. He was a preacher of righteousness. Didn't convert anybody but his family. But he was a preacher of righteousness, 100+ years. The exact number escapes me right now, but 100+ years he preached. And when the doors closed on the ark, it was him and his family. How positive did he have to stay to keep preaching and teaching, even though nobody was responding? It's not the response that we're responsible for. We're responsible for the message. We have to keep on, keeping on, telling people about Christ, no matter what their response might be. That's our job as Christians. And we have to remain optimistic about that. Right along with optimism is enthusiasm. I think enthusiasm is contagious, but if we're not careful, negativity is just as contagious. You know, they say misery loves company, and that's very true. I can start talking bad about anyone, and I can probably find somebody that would agree with me. What if we only talk positive about people? Only talked about people with enthusiasm. And I'm so glad this person is a member of the church here at Pacific, or I'm so glad this person is a proclaimer of God's word. All of us have had experiences in our life that are not pleasant, every one of us. And that's going to happen. But it should never, ever dampen my enthusiasm for the Lord and for Christ's church. I've had people tell me, well, this person, they said this and it hurt my feelings, and so I'm not coming back. I've had that happen many times, unfortunately. And I always suggest to them, why would you let a person keep you away from the Lord? Don't let a person keep you away from the Lord. It's interesting when we stop and really think about what enthusiasm is. I'm not a big fan of Vince Lombardi, but he said, this is what he would say to his players. You will be fired with enthusiasm, or you will be fired with enthusiasm. Did you get it? Someone's going to let you go because of lack of enthusiasm. But you can be fired up with enthusiasm. That's what he's saying. We need to be fired up for the Lord. Jeremiah said, not preaching the gospel or proclaiming the gospel, he had to do that. It was like a fire in his bones that would not be put out. That's how we need to be. We need to be enthusiastic. We have to have fire in our bones the way the great prophet did. Zeal is a biblical must, Brother Winkler says. Turn over to Titus chapter 2. Titus chapter 2. At the beginning of the chapter, he's talking about different ages of people that are in the church, talking about Christians. And he goes through the list. Older men, older women, what they can do to help the Lord's church. Younger women, younger men, what they can do to help the Lord's church. He even talks about bond slaves being subject to their own masters and everything, to be well-pleasing. He said they need to show faith in God. And that was a reality in the first century. Some people would put themselves into slavery in order to pay off a debt. That's what a bond slave is. They were not forced into slavery. They chose to go into slavery. When you really think about that concept, by the way, that's what Christianity is in one sense. We are bond servants. I place myself into service to God through Christ. But then look, as he starts to wrap it up, he gives verse number 11. For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all men. I would suggest to you, he's talking about Christ being the grace of God here. John chapter 1 tells us that the law came through Moses, but grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ. I think that's about verse 18 of John chapter 1. Here he tells us the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all men, instructing us, teaching us to deny ungodliness, worldly desires, live sensibly, righteously, godly in the present age, looking for the blessed hope and the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior Christ Jesus. Now notice verse 14, who gave himself for us to redeem us from every lawless deed, purify for himself a people for his own possession. And let's not forget the last phrase. Why is he doing all of that? Because he wants his people to be zealous for good deeds. Zealous is another word for enthusiasm. If I've got zeal for Christ, I've got enthusiasm for Christ. And as an elder, that is a must. If I'm going to lead others to be enthusiastic, I must be enthusiastic myself. I cannot expect anybody else to be enthusiastic if I'm not enthusiastic. When we are enthusiastic, it will be contagious. Even if we come across someone who's cynical and negative, don't let that dampen your enthusiasm. Make up your mind ahead of time. When I come across those people, they're not going to dampen me. They're not going to quench the enthusiastic spirit that I want to show to others. I want to be that fired up person for Christ. That's what I've got to decide ahead of time, because you're going to encounter those people. You're going to encounter those who slam the door in your face. Should not dampen your enthusiasm. There was a preacher that came out of preaching school, and he immediately started door knocking every single afternoon. And he says, I'm looking for one Bible study today. And invariably, the people would turn him away. And he says, well, that wasn't the one person today. And then he would go to the next door, and the next door, and the next door, and the next door. But eventually, he would find that person. One of the things that has helped me in not giving up when it seems the odds are against you, two things. Most of you by now know I'm a big baseball fan, and yes, I know they're not going to make the playoffs. Esteban reminded me of that yesterday, that his team is going to be in the playoffs. Yeah, I get it. Okay. I feel like a Cub fan. Wait till next year. All right. Anyway, one of the things about baseball that has always attracted me is they fail more than they succeed. Even the best hitter fails 70 or 60-something% of the time. And yet they're considered to be a really good ball player when they can hit 300, that's roughly 30, well it is, it's 30%. They just take the decimal point out to the hundreds. But and there's very few this year that are hitting that. The good hitters are right now are considered 270 to 290, 27% success. Wow. So I can fail 73% of the time and be considered good. Wow. That's pretty cool. Yeah. Yeah, weathermen. Yeah. They are really good, by the way. I'm telling you what happened yesterday. Man, they are good at that, aren't they? Here's what happened yesterday. And then but when it comes to tomorrow, it's a little different. You know, they're hit and miss. We know that. And we're all good at that, aren't we? I can tell you what happened yesterday. Well, mostly yesterday. I don't remember everything. But I can tell you what happened yesterday. I know what I had for dinner last night because I was at the picnic, right? So it's interesting, though, when you stop and think about that from evangelism point, going back to what Donald said. Well, we tried that, we weren't successful. What's success? How did you rate the success? What was your goal? Was your goal just to teach the gospel, or was your goal we have to have 30 baptisms or it isn't a success? We need to be very careful when we limit God in that way. Because we're saying then, God told me to proclaim the gospel. He didn't tell me I was going to convert everybody, or I was going to have a certain percentage of conversions. God nowhere says that. He says, you go and you teach. Those that want to respond will respond. God gives the increase. Paul was very clear on that. Here, Jesus says, I want a people that are zealous. That's not I can be zealous if I want to be, but it doesn't really matter if I am. That's not how we should look at that. When I become a Christian, I should want to be enthusiastic. I should choose to be enthusiastic every single day. Now, granted, I'm human just like you are, and there's going to be days I don't feel so enthusiastic. There's going to be days that my zeal is going to wane, not be so good. But the majority of the time and the majority of the days, I need to be enthusiastic for God, for Christ. All right. So, Brother Winkler says, elders need to be enthusiastic about their work, their role. They need to look at their eldership as, this is something I wanted to do, and I will do it with everything that I am. And really, that's just a mature Christian when you stop and think about it. I want to be the best Christian I can be every single day. How do I do that? One way is to be enthusiastic about it. And when I come into the assembly, sometimes that's really easy to do, but there's days where you wake up and you don't feel as enthusiastic as you may have other days. And so you come into the assembly, and invariably, if you are generally an enthusiastic person and some reason you're not on a particular gathering, what's going to happen? People are going to say, what's wrong with you? Are you all right? Are you sick? What's going on? We should be that person. That when we're not enthusiastic, people wonder what's going on. Are you having a bad day? We can be enthusiastic. We can choose to be enthusiastic. And we can choose to be positive. Every single day it's a choice. It really comes down to that. He also says elders need to be enthusiastic about the local church. Listen, we should be not only cheerleaders for our fellow brothers and sisters here, but in essence, we're being a cheerleader for Christ. And I don't mean that we've got to get up and do a routine rah-rah, sis-boom-bah thing. That's not what I'm saying. But if people talk about anything as a Christian, we ought to be enthusiastic about our local congregation. Why would anyone ever want to come and visit here if I'm not enthusiastic about Pacific Church of Christ? If I meet people and they're like, hey, where do you go? Well, I go to Pacific Church over in Pacific. That's not enthusiastic, is it? And why would they want to come there? But if I meet and greet somebody and say, hey, how was your weekend? It was great. It was great because I met with a group of people at the Pacific Church of Christ, and we are on fire for Jesus. Now, sometimes we may look at that phrasing that I just used and say, ooh, oh man, they're going to think I'm a Jesus freak. I hope they do think that. Quite frankly, I hope they do. If that turns them off, they're not the person that is going to convert to the Lord's church, at least not at first. But I can be enthusiastic in so many other ways, but I should never shy away from the fact that I met with the Lord's church on Sunday. If someone asks me tomorrow, now I know my job is here, I get that. But your job is not. At your job tomorrow, if you're at your job tomorrow and someone asks you what you did over the weekend, let them know. If you went to the picnic on Saturday, say, I spent Saturday at the park with my church family, and then we met for worship and praised God together on Sunday. What did you do this weekend? Ask them. And when they tell you, don't be negative about it. Say, well, that's great. I'm glad you had a good weekend, if they had a good weekend. Would you like to come and visit the Church of Christ with me next week? Yeah. I almost want to bring Everly May in here. She knocked with me on several doors, and she said, Paul, can I talk? Absolutely, you can. So what she did, she said, what do I say? I said, you tell them I'm Everly May, and we're talking to people about the Church of Christ. And she said, okay. So here's what she actually did. Hi, I'm Everly May. We're from the Pacific Church of Christ, and this is my Paul. Which was perfect. I took it from there, and we invited them to services and gave them the pamphlet and let them know the pamphlet explained to them what to expect if they decided to visit. So we'll see. I look at that and I say, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if no one of the 240 that we door knocked, if none of them come. At least we told 240 people about this congregation. And we just never know. Yes? Yeah. So we door knocked, and could affect 10% of the people. Right. Yeah. Some of them had, several of them had dogs. Because whenever I knock on the door, I heard the dogs. Maybe we should have a dog park. Never mind, I'm just kidding. Getting off on something completely different. All right, so we just got a few minutes left in class this morning. Elders need to be enthusiastic about the future, not just what's going on right now. If the elders are not setting, we talked about them being visionary, that needs to be with enthusiasm. Setting goals with enthusiasm. We are going to reach for this goal. And even if we don't set it, it's a goal that is worthy of going after. The more that type of language is done, the better it happens. I go back to my retail days often whenever I'm talking about this, but let me give you an example real quick. So I was assigned, whenever I started working for, I don't say this with enthusiasm, but Michael's Arts and Crafts. I started working for them several years ago. And I went to a store that was, whenever you come into a new company, they don't give you the best store in the district, believe it or not. They give you the one that needs help. That's why they're hiring somebody. They let someone go, and it's usually the worst performing store in the district. So I was given this store, and they did a rating of A, B, C, D, and if you got rated lower than a D, your store was in trouble, and the district manager was coming back in 3 days, and you better have everything straightened out. Well, this store had been a C and a D for over a year. So when I came into it, it was a mess. It was just a big mess. And so my background in retail, you start from the receiving end. You start from the back room. You get the back room organized before you can get the floor organized. And I told my boss this was my goal, to get the back room organized first. I said, you're going to see the results, but it's going to be a little while before the floor gets there. It took a short time because I got the people fired up about how productive we can be and how much nicer it's going to be to come back into the back room and actually find what you're looking for without having to dig through 50 different boxes to find whatever item it might be in your department. So we all pitched in, we all got the back room straightened out, and within 3 months, that store went from being a D store to a B, a solid B, and it wasn't long that we were in the A category. And it wasn't because of me. It was just because I gave them direction and told them they could do it. So God does that for us. And I'm not equating myself with God by any means, but God gives us his holy word and he says, you can do this. Now, how do I know that? Jesus would not have told the apostles something they couldn't accomplish. He would not have told them, this is what I want you to do. You go in all creation and you preach the gospel. And then he didn't turn to Peter and say, you're not going to make it, but, I got to give you guys a goal. Jesus didn't do that. Jesus didn't do that. He fully expected that they would go in all creation and preach the gospel. And they did it. We just have to set goals for ourselves individually and collectively and go after them and say, we're going to make this happen. No matter if it's been tried before and it didn't work, or if it's been tried in the past and didn't work, we're going to retry. Try and try and try again, right? If at first you don't succeed. We've heard that cliche probably many times in our lives. But we have to keep going. Yes, Tracy? I haven't known anyone that young, but about 3 years ago, there was Jeff Miller, who is with Apologetics Press. He's actually a family friend of ours, and he stayed at our house, and he had an intern with him who was just out of high school and was getting ready to go into his freshman year of college. And he was interning with Apologetics Press with Dr. Jeff, and they were going to explore some caves at the time. He was working on a project showing that caves were formed during the flood differently than what science says how they were formed. But anyway, this young man, I asked him, I said, what is your goal for doing this internship? And he says, well, to gain knowledge about evidence that show God. He said, but my ultimate goal is to be an elder. He's not married, very young man. He says, my ultimate goal is to move toward an eldership. I've never seen a young man other than that like that. However, the Lads to Leaders program, I will tell you this, they know for a fact that many of their people that follow the Lads to Leaders program wind up becoming preachers and elders in the future. What was your second question? All right. Stay tuned in for next week. We appreciate all the comments and all the kind attention during class today. Thank you.